Imagine this. It is a scorching July morning in the year 1518. You, re-walking along the cobbled streets of Strasbourg, a thriving city within the Holy Roman Empire. Merchants are setting up their market stalls. Children laugh and chase each other through the squares. Everything feels calm, ordinary, and alive with the rhythms of daily life. But then, you turn a corner, and what you see burns itself into your memory. There, in the middle of the street, is a woman. She's dancing, but not with joy. This isn't a festival, or even a fit of madness. It's something darker, something terrifying. Her shoes are soaked in blood. Her dress clings to her body with sweat. Her eyes are wide, panicked, hollowed out with exhaustion. She moves as if possessed, unable to stop, no matter how desperately she wants to. Her name is Frau Trophia, and what is happening to her will soon unleash one of the most bewildering episodes of collective hysteria in human history. What began as one woman's mysterious affliction would soon spiral out of control. Within weeks, hundreds were dancing uncontrollably in the streets, many to their deaths, not from illness, not from poison, but from sheer exhaustion, cardiac arrest, and the horrifying inability to stop moving. This is the true story of the dancing plague of 1518, a medical enigma so strange that even today, science struggles to explain it. A haunting glimpse into the vulnerabilities of the human mind and the fears that once gripped medieval Europe. Before we step deeper into this unsettling tale of suffering and survival, if you're fascinated by the hidden corners of history, consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this one. And feel free to comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. I find it remarkable that we can explore these long-lost stories together from all across the globe, connected by a shared curiosity about the past. It was July 14th, 1518, when Frau Trophia stepped out into the narrow street outside her home and began to dance. But to call it dancing would be misleading. This was something else entirely. Something violent. Her limbs flailed erratically, as though her body had been seized by some invisible force. Onlookers said she looked like a puppet jerking and twisting under the control of some drunken master. There was no rhythm, no grace, just relentless, chaotic motion driven by something no one could understand. Her legs kicked and stomped the ground with such violent force that bits of stone began to crack and scatter from the cobblestones beneath her. But what made the scene truly horrifying was this. She couldn't stop. Hour after hour, Frau Trophia remained locked in her frenzied movements. When neighbors, alarmed and confused, rushed over to help her, she pushed them away, her limbs still flailing, her body twisting as if caught in some invisible storm. When they offered her water, she tried to drink, but never paused. Most of it spilled down her chin and soaked into her dress as she kept moving. By midday, under the brutal July sun, her condition only worsened. Sweat poured from her body, darkening her clothes and pooling on the street beneath her feet. Her breathing became ragged, shallow, each gasp more desperate than the last. And yet, she kept going. The most disturbing detail comes from those who witnessed her that day. It was clear Frau Trophia was trying to stop. Her face twisted in fear and agony, drained of all color. At moments, she screamed out in German, begging for mercy, pleading with God to end it, but her body would not obey. She had become trapped inside herself, a conscious mind imprisoned within a body that no longer responded to reason or will. By evening, a crowd had gathered around her. Theories began to spread like wildfire. Some whispered that she was possessed by evil spirits. Others believed she had been cursed, perhaps the victim of witchcraft. A few claimed she had eaten bread tainted with ergot, a hallucinogenic mold that could cause convulsions and delirium. But none of these explanations accounted for one chilling fact. She simply couldn't stop dancing. As night fell, torches and street lanterns were lit, casting flickering shadows over the cobblestones. Still she danced. Concerned townspeople took turns watching over her. Some brought blankets as she trembled, still moving. Others offered food, though she couldn't eat while trapped in constant motion. Many simply knelt and prayed, convinced they were witnessing either a miracle or a curse. To them, it looked like she was suffering in her own waking nightmare. Then, the unthinkable happened. It spread. What followed next defied all logic and slipped into the realm of collective psychological horror. On the second day of Frau Trofia's ordeal, a man from the neighborhood named Herr Laus reported feeling an overwhelming, irresistible urge to move. At first, it was nothing more than a tremble in his legs, a jittery energy that made it difficult to sit still. But within hours, he too was in the streets, moving wildly, as though compelled by the same force. But within hours, Klaus found himself powerless to resist the overwhelming compulsion to dance. Unlike Frau Trofia's wild, spasmodic thrashing, Klaus's movements were strangely elegant, almost refined. His steps mimicked the rhythm of a ballroom waltz. He turned in smooth arcs, arms raised as if he were holding a partner only he could see. His body moved in time with music no one else could hear locked in a private concert, as graceful as it was unsettling. The sight of two people dancing in separate, uncontrollable trances in the middle of a city street quickly drew larger crowds. Strasbourg had never seen anything like it. Street vendors abandoned their carts. Children stopped playing. Priests ran from their chapels to witness what many believed to be either divine intervention or a sign of demonic possession. But this was only the beginning. By the third day, 6 more individuals had joined them. By the end of the first week, over 30 residents of Strasbourg were caught in this hellish choreography, and each new dancer brought their own terrifying variation of the affliction. Some thrashed wildly, just like Frau Trofia, violent and disjointed. Others, like Klaus, moved as though engaged in courtly dance, gliding and spinning with eerie grace. Some seemed to march in step, as if obeying silent military commands, saluting and stomping with forced precision. A few clapped and twirled like they were part of a rustic village festival, stomping and spinning in cheerful rhythms, yet their faces showed only panic and despair. Despite their differences, they all shared one unmistakable trait: they could not stop. And behind every movement, behind every twist and turn, was the unmistakable look of sheer terror, eyes pleading for release, minds trapped inside bodies that had become strangers to them. What disturbed the witnesses most wasn't simply the number of dancers, but how the madness spread. It wasn't random. There was a clear pattern. Those who stood and watched for long periods, those who lingered too close, seemed the most likely to succumb. Family members who cared for the afflicted often began to dance themselves within days. The plague seemed to bypass touch, skip breath, and leap from eye to mind. It was as if watching was the disease, as though witnessing this strange ritual somehow planted the seed of compulsion in the minds of the spectators, rewiring them until they, too, were seized by the need to move. A physician visiting Strasbourg at the time, Dr. Johann Weyer, recorded his observations in a journal. "I have seen plagues of the flesh buboes in rot, decay, and fever. But this is no sickness of the body. It is a plague of the soul. It leaps from vision to thought, from thought to limb, and it makes rational men into puppets strung up by forces neither divine nor earthly." The city's response only made things worse. Faced with a crisis no one could explain, the officials of Strasbourg made a decision that would go down as one of the most disastrously misguided public health responses in recorded history. After consulting with physicians, priests, and civic leaders, the authorities arrived at a conclusion that today seems almost unthinkable. The afflicted were suffering because they weren't dancing enough. According to the prevailing medical theories of the time, the cause of the affliction was an excess of internal heat, a disturbance of the body's humors. The belief was that the only way to purge this feverish imbalance was to let it burn itself out through continued movement. Just as sweat could break a fever, dancing intensely and to exhaustion was believed to be the cure. So the city acted. They constructed a large wooden stage in the town square. They hired musicians to play lively tunes, believing music would guide the afflicted into more regulated rhythms. Healthy volunteers were encouraged to join the dancers, hoping their presence might stabilize the chaos. Even professional performers from neighboring towns were brought in paid by the city to model correct posture and form, as if the right choreography could end the nightmare. What followed was a catastrophe. The introduction of music had the opposite effect. Where once the dancers had moved to their own internal torment, they were now driven by external rhythms. Their motions became more intense, more synchronized, yet no less frantic. The beat of drums and fiddles seemed to deepen the trance, not break it. Worse still, the professional dancers who had come to help soon found themselves unable to leave the stage. One by one, they too succumbed. What began as a treatment turned into recruitment. The plague absorbed them all. The stage meant to contain the dancing became the epicenter of it. It drew even larger crowds, and with those growing audiences came a new wave of infections. People who had never danced before now found themselves twitching, spinning, or collapsing into motion after only minutes of watching. The music, echoing through the streets of Strasbourg, became a kind of summoning spell triggering the affliction in people who had never even seen the original victims. Within just a few days of launching this so-called cure, the number of active dancers exploded from a few dozen to over 100. The city square descended into madness. Imagine the scene: bodies collapsing and rising again in endless motion. Musicians playing in terror, afraid that stopping might cause the dancers to become violent. Crowds huddled at the edges, torn between horror and helpless curiosity, knowing that even watching too long might be enough to draw them in. It no longer looked like a town in crisis. It looked like a vision from Dante's Inferno. Contemporary observers described it as hell let loose upon the earth. Day and night, the sounds echoed through the city hundreds of feet, pounding against wooden platforms, a frenzied blur of drums and fiddles. And cutting through it all, the sharp cries of pain, of panic, of people reaching the edge of human endurance. What had started as a strange spectacle quickly spiraled into a full-blown disaster. The human body was never meant to move like this, not without rest, not without end. The first death occurred on the 7th day. Frau Trophia, the woman who began it all, collapsed mid-spin. She never stood again. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac exhaustion. Her heart quite literally unable to keep pace with the relentless demands of her body. But witnesses described something more unsettling. They said she didn't merely fall. She danced herself to death. In her final moments, her movements grew jagged, desperate, as if she were resisting unseen chains pulling her limbs. Her breath came in gasps, shallow and ragged, barely keeping up with the erratic jerks of her body. And when she finally crumpled to the ground, her legs still twitched, her fingers still fluttered. For minutes, her body kept moving as though life itself had refused to accept she was gone. And she was only the first. The death toll began to climb. City records, what survive of them, paint a grim picture. Some victims died of heart attacks, their organs simply giving out under the unrelenting strain. Others suffered strokes, blood cut off from their brains as their limbs demanded every last drop of strength. But the most haunting deaths were those the physicians of the day recorded under a chilling phrase, exhaustion of the soul. These individuals did not collapse with a scream or a spasm. They simply faded. Their bodies continued to move, arms swaying, legs stepping, faces blank, eyes glazed, staring through the world, as if something inside had gone silent. They danced until their bodies could no longer follow orders, until joints failed, until breath stopped, until they simply crumpled, like broken puppets whose strings had finally snapped. And yet the music played on, and the crowd still watched, and the plague still spread. The dancers couldn't eat. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't even drink properly. Their bodies refused to rest. The compulsion to move was relentless, even when exhaustion left them trembling. Meals were impossible. The act of chewing, of swallowing, required stillness they could not achieve. Attempts to eat led to choking. Drinking often resulted in vomiting, as their bodies jolted mid-sip. Dr. Paracelsus, a physician who arrived in Strasbourg at the height of the outbreak, recorded the grim details of their physical decline. His journal reads like a horror chronicle. He described dancers whose feet had worn down to raw, bloody stump skin torn away, bone exposed. Others had dislocated joints from the endless thrashing. Muscles, deprived of rest and nourishment, began to consume themselves in a desperate attempt to generate energy. Some dancers developed what he called the fever of motion, an internal fire that pushed their body temperatures to dangerous levels. As the heat rose within them, many slipped into delirium. They screamed, hallucinated, flailed violently. The dancing became more chaotic, more dangerous, less human. By the end of July 1518, the death toll had climbed into the dozens. Hundreds more were showing signs of the affliction. And the worst part? No one was getting better. The city teetered on the edge of collapse. With so many citizens afflicted, there were few left to tend to the sick. Shops shuttered. Commerce halted. Families fled in fear. Strasbourg, once a thriving medieval hub, became a ghost city echoing with the sound of dancing feet. In the vacuum of understanding, theories bloomed, some spiritual, others scientific, none entirely satisfying. Religious leaders were quick to point fingers at the supernatural. To them, this could only be the work of demons. The dancers didn't respond to prayer. They twitched in the presence of holy relics. And perhaps most damning of all, the affliction seemed to spread through mere observation, an unnatural contagion of the soul. Father Heinrich Kramer, infamous author of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, traveled to Strasbourg to investigate. His conclusion? The city had fallen under a coordinated spell, cast by a secret coven of witches determined to dismantle Christian society from within. His proposed solution: mass witch trials followed by executions. To Strasbourg's credit, the city declined. Physicians, meanwhile, clung to their own frameworks. Many returned to the theory of hot blood, believing that the dancers were suffering from an overheated internal state that could only be purged through continued movement. But another theory gained traction: ergot poisoning. Ergot is a toxic mold that grows on rye in damp conditions. When consumed, it can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and muscle spasm symptoms eerily similar to what was being observed in the afflicted. Today, ergot is known to be chemically similar to LSD and has been linked to outbreaks of mass hysteria throughout history. But even this couldn't explain the whole picture. How could a poisoned loaf of bread lead to weeks of dancing? Why did merely watching the dancers seem to infect new victims? Why did music intensify the symptoms? By the time August approached, Strasbourg was no closer to understanding the plague, and the bodies were still piling up. Ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on damp rye, was one of the first culprits suspected. It contains alkaloids similar to LSD and can induce violent convulsions, vivid hallucinations, and involuntary movements. It's a tempting explanation. But it fails to account for one crucial detail. The plague didn't spread through ingestion. It spread through sight. People weren't getting sick from bread. They were getting sick from watching. This led some physicians to turn inward to the mind rather than the body. They proposed melancholia, a diagnosis used in medieval medicine to describe intense sadness or spiritual despair. In today's terms, we might call it clinical depression. These doctors suggested that the afflicted weren't cursed or poisoned, but broken, that their bodies expressed what their souls could not, a longing to escape through self-destruction. They observed that most of the dancers came from the city's poorest quarters, people who had endured starvation, grief, and profound hopelessness. Perhaps dancing, in its most horrifying form, was a kind of despair turned outward. Meanwhile, the stars offered other answers. Astrologers pointed to the skies, noting that 1518 had been a year of strange celestial events. A blazing comet had passed over Europe, a glowing sword in the heavens that many saw as a bad omen. They believed these astronomical disturbances had disturbed the balance of the body and mind, unleashing unseen forces on Earth. According to them, the heavens had cast a madness upon Strasbourg. Modern science, with all its sophistication, hasn't brought much comfort. Today, the most widely accepted theory is that of mass psychogenic illness, a collective psychological breakdown triggered by extreme and prolonged stress. A kind of mental domino effect. And Strasbourg was primed for collapse. That summer, the city faced crippling food shortages. Disease ran rampant. Political tensions simmered beneath the surface. For many, life had become unbearable. In such conditions, mass hysteria doesn't just become possible, it becomes almost inevitable. This theory explains why the plague primarily affected the poor, why it seemed to leap from person to person through mere observation, why every new dancer mirrored the same desperation. Because it wasn't a physical illness, it was a psychological scream that infected the body. But not all experts are convinced. Some neurologists suggest a physiological cause, pointing to historical outbreaks of encephalitis lethargica, a mysterious sleeping sickness that affected thousands in the early 20th century. Some victims developed uncontrollable motor tics, spasms, or compulsive behaviors that mirror what was seen in 1518. Others propose an early form of conversion disorder, where the mind converts deep trauma into real physical symptoms. In that view, the dancers were not insane. They were responding to unthinkable suffering the only way they could, through motion. Their bodies betrayed their pain because their voices could not. Yet perhaps the most unsettling modern theory is the simplest one, that this was an early and devastating example of social contagion. A single woman dancing in the street became a mirror for others' pain, a reflection of their helplessness. And in watching her, they too fell into the rhythm of collapse. Behaviors, emotions, and even ideas can spread through populations like infectious diseases. In our hyper-connected modern world, we see striking parallels from viral internet challenges to mass panic events and conspiracy-driven movements. The dancing plague of 1518 may have been one of history's first documented cases of an idea becoming physically contagious, spreading from person to person, not through contact or food, but through sight, emotion, and shared psychological tension. What began as one woman's uncontrollable movements quickly became a citywide affliction, the end of the dance. Remarkably, the plague didn't end through any known medical treatment or spiritual exorcism. Instead, it ceased after one of the strangest medical prescriptions ever recorded, a mass pilgrimage to the shrine of a saint believed to have dominion over dancing. By early August 1518, with bodies piling up and the city's infrastructure crumbling, officials gave up on traditional responses. They organized a city-funded pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Vitus, located in the nearby town of Hohenstein. St. Vitus was a curious choice. Though he was the patron of dancers and entertainers, he was more importantly associated with curing St. Vitus dance, a medieval name for involuntary movement disorders, like what we now call Huntington's disease. Transporting over 400 people in a state of compulsive, ceaseless motion posed a logistical nightmare. The city commissioned carts, wagons, and dozens of able-bodied citizens to help physically restrain and escort the afflicted. What followed was a bizarre and haunting procession. Witnesses describe a seemingly endless line of dancers, some tied down in carts, others lurching forward in fits and spasms surrounded by family, doctors, clergy, and a growing crowd of onlookers. The sound of hundreds of shuffling, twitching bodies mixed with weeping and prayer. echoed through the countryside as the procession made its way out of Strasbourg on August 3rd. The sound of the procession echoed across the countryside, hundreds of people caught in various stages of involuntary movement, accompanied by whispered prayers, muffled sobs, and the rhythmic creaking of wooden wheels. It was a sound no one could forget. What happened when the caravan reached the shrine of St. Vitus defies easy explanation, even by the standards of the 16th century. According to numerous witnesses, including sworn statements from city officials, something extraordinary unfolded. Each dancer, one by one, was brought before the altar. As the resident priests performed blessings, something changed. The frantic motions began to slow, not all at once, but in small, visible degrees. The jerking gave way to trembling, then to stillness. It wasn't dramatic or miraculous in the cinematic sense. It was gradual, painfully human. Most dancers didn't collapse or cry out in relief. They simply began to quiet, to still, as if the plague that had gripped their bodies was finally releasing its hold. Dr. Yon Va, a physician who accompanied the procession to observe its outcome, later wrote, "In all my years of study, I have encountered things that defy reason, but never have I witnessed such a profound display of faith's power over flesh. Whether it was divine mercy or the strange workings of the human spirit, the curse that had tormented them vanished within a single day. By the evening of August 4th, fewer than a dozen dancers remained affected, and by the following morning, the strange and terrifying plague that had shaken Strasbourg was over." The aftermath and legacy. What followed was nearly as unsettling as the dancing itself. Hundreds of people who had lost weeks to mindless motion found themselves still but changed. They weren't the same men and women who had stepped into the streets that summer. Many suffered what we would now call severe post-traumatic stress. They reported nightmares, episodes of deep depression, and a visceral fear of music or any repetitive sound. Some refused to go outdoors, afraid that hearing a drumbeat or the cadence of footsteps might trigger another attack. A few became completely reclusive, cutting off contact with even their families. The toll on their bodies was no less devastating. Weeks of constant involuntary motion left many with lifelong injuries, damaged joints, strained muscles, and heart problems that lingered for years, if not decades. Some never walked normally again. Some survivors never fully regained the ability to walk properly. But beyond the physical injuries, it was the psychological wounds that proved most haunting. Many described the terrifying sensation of being trapped inside their own bodies, conscious and aware, but unable to control their limbs. This loss of agency left deep scars, shaking their ability to trust their own thoughts, impulses, and physical instincts long after the dancing had stopped. The trauma extended beyond individuals. The city of Strasbourg itself was left deeply shaken. In the aftermath, public dancing was outlawed except during approved religious festivals. Street performers were strictly regulated. Anyone whose music was deemed too rhythmic or enticing could be fined or even imprisoned. The wooden platform built to support the afflicted dancers was torn down and burned. The square where it once stood was consecrated to ward off any recurrence of the madness. Economically, the damage was catastrophic. It's estimated that Strasbourg lost nearly 15% of its adult population, either through death, long-term disability, or mass migration. Entire neighborhoods emptied out as terrified residents fled, fearing they might be next. It took over a decade for the city to regain its previous vitality. But perhaps the most enduring consequence was the imprint left on Europe's collective memory. Word of the strange plague spread far and wide, stirring fear, wonder, and imitation. Smaller outbreaks of compulsive dancing were reported in at least a dozen other towns over the following decades. Though none reached the same scale, their existence showed that the phenomenon wasn't isolated, it was a pattern. This bizarre event quietly reshaped how Europeans thought about mental health, crowd behavior, and the power of suggestion. For the first time, civic and religious authorities began to acknowledge that emotional distress could produce genuine physical illness, a recognition that laid the early groundwork for what we now know as psychiatry. Modern echoes. Are we still dancing? To us, the dancing plague of 1518 might seem like a strange footnote in history, a medieval oddity. But its echoes persist in ways that are far more modern than we'd like to admit. Think of the viral challenges that sweep across social media, some harmless, others disturbingly dangerous. From the Ice Bucket Challenge to the Tide Pod craze and the infamous Momo Challenge, we see people often young and vulnerable, compelled to engage in bizarre or risky behavior simply because others are doing it. The mechanism is the same: social contagion. Just like the dancers in Strasbourg, these behaviors begin with observation and suggestion. They spread not because they make sense, but because we're wired to imitate. In a hyper-connected age, ideas don't just travel fast, they leap into our minds, sometimes with consequences as real and harmful as any physical virus. From harmless fads like the Ice Bucket Challenge to far more troubling trends such as the Tide Pod Challenge or the Momo Oaks, the same unsettling pattern emerges. An idea spreads, usually through observation and imitation. People feel strangely compelled to join in, even when they recognize the risks. The behavior leaps from one person to the next, often escaping its original context and escalating into something far larger. Events we once dismissed as mass hysteria still occur in today's supposedly rational world. Take the clown sightings of 2016, for instance. Across multiple countries, thousands reported terrifying encounters with menacing clowns. Despite a lack of physical evidence, the fear spread rapidly through social media, igniting real panic and forcing law enforcement to respond to what was, essentially, a psychological wildfire. Even more disturbing are modern cases of mass psychogenic illness, outbreaks of genuine physical symptoms without a clear medical cause, passed along by suggestion and stress. In 2011, in the town of Leroy, New York, a group of teenage girls suddenly began displaying tics, vocal outbursts, and spasms. The symptoms spread through their social circles, baffling doctors. A year later in Cambodia, more than 200 factory workers collapsed or went into seizures with no physical illness to explain the events. In both cases, stress, fear, and social proximity acted as vectors, just like in 1518. These modern dancing plagues follow the same blueprint. They strike populations under pressure. They travel through human connection. They manifest in real physical symptoms. And they often defy conventional treatment. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is that, in the digital age, we may be more vulnerable to these outbreaks than ever before. With smartphones and social platforms, ideas and behaviors spread at light speed. We're exposed not just to our local environment, but to the emotional contagions of millions of strangers around the globe. We may be just one viral moment away from our own version of a psychological epidemic. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 couldn't grasp how a thought could become physically contagious. Their information moved no faster than a horse could gallop. And yet, they still fell victim to a wave of mental and physical compulsion that swept through their streets like wildfire. Today, with our instant communication and global reach, the question isn't whether another outbreak will happen. It's when, where, and in what form. We live in an age where information moves at the speed of light and reaches billions of people within moments. Our understanding of psychology, neuroscience, and social behavior has grown more advanced than ever before. And yet, we continue to witness the same unsettling truth. Human consciousness is more delicate and interconnected than we often admit. The dancing plague serves as a stark reminder that the boundary between personal experience and collective behavior is far thinner than we imagine. When fear, stress, and social tension reach a critical point, entire communities can unravel experiencing psychological crises that manifest in very real physical ways. Though often remembered as a historical oddity, the dancing plague of 1518 also stands as a cautionary tale for our modern world. It reveals how fragile the human mind can be, and how quickly an idea, once released, can spread like a sickness. Frauofia stepped into the street in Strasbourg and began to dance, driven by something deep within her, whether trauma, neurological disorder, or something still beyond our understanding. But what began as one woman's mysterious compulsion soon spiraled into a citywide catastrophe, not because of weakness, but because of connection. The hundreds who followed her were not foolish. They were ordinary people living under extraordinary strain. And like all of us, they were wired to mimic and reflect the behaviors of those around them. What happened to them was not madness. It was one of the most human responses possible. The plague eventually ended at the shrine of St. Vitus, but the conditions that gave birth to its social pressure, economic despair, political unrest, and a deep longing for meaning never disappeared. In fact, in today's hyper-connected world, they may be stronger than ever. We are all potential dancers, waiting often unknowingly for the right mix of fear, suggestion, and social influence to trigger movements we can't control. The rhythm may change. Viral trends, mass delusions, conspiracy spirals, political extremism. But the pattern remains the same. The people of Strasbourg learned a haunting truth, that ideas can infect like disease, that the mind is fragile, and that the line between me and us can vanish in an instant. They learned these lessons through blood, exhaustion, and the desperate rhythm of feet that refuse to stop. The real question is, will we learn those same lessons before it's too late? And when the next plague comes, whatever form it takes, will we recognize it for what it truly is? Or will we join the dance once more, unaware of the steps we're taking? Perhaps the most chilling truth about the dancing plague is that, even after 500 years, we still don't know exactly why it began or why it ended. Despite all our scientific progress and technological mastery, the events of 1518 remain wrapped in mystery. And that fact alone speaks to something deeply unsettling. There are forces within the human mind and between human minds that we still don't fully comprehend. Forces that can ripple through a population like a fever, that defy logic, and that can be just as contagious and lethal as any virus. The dancers of Strasbourg are long gone, but their story remains. A ghostly echo reminding us that we are not as rational, not as independent, and not as immune to mass delusion as we'd like to believe. We are social beings wired for connection, vulnerable to suggestion, and sometimes swept into movements we neither choose nor understand. And somewhere, perhaps right now, in some overburdened community, the next dance may already be beginning.